She was alone. 8 months pregnant. Locked inside a supply room of a Sydney Harbourside estate worth $500 million. And the man who put her there was 3 corridors away, toasting his new fiancée with a glass of Penfolds Grange in front of 300 guests. March 14, 2022. Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. 11:47 in the evening. Outside, fireworks. Champagne. The private celebration of one of Australia's most powerful billionaires broadcast to his inner circle like a personal coronation. Inside, a 33-year-old nurse from Batangas, Philippines, biting down on a folded surgical cloth so nobody in that magnificent house would hear her scream. No doctor. No family. No way out. Just her. Her training. And a newborn boy who had decided, quite firmly, that tonight was the night. Now here's your first question. If you were locked inside that room, no phone, no passport, no one coming, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because what this woman did next is not what most of us would even think of. What she did in that room with nothing but her bare hands and sheer will would eventually bring one of the wealthiest private dynasties in Australian history to its knees in a way no lawyer, no journalist, and no whistleblower managed to do before her. But here is what nobody tells you about women like Cylindra Vega Fortunato. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been waiting for the right moment. And for 8 months, completely invisible to everyone around her, she had been building one before. Stay with me. Because we are only 30 seconds in, and I promise you, this gets so much worse before it gets better. The morning after Cylindra Fortunato arrived at the Alderton estate in Palm Beach, Sydney, the household manager, let's call her Mrs. Whitmore, met her at the staff entrance with a warm smile, a pressed blazer, and a clipboard held with both hands. She asked for Cylindra's phone first. Standard protocol, she explained, for all live-in medical staff. Privacy protection for the family. She would get it back on weekends. Then she asked for her passport. Also standard. Also logged. A printed receipt was handed over with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The transaction took less than 90 seconds. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody made a threat. There was no moment that would have felt, looking back, like a warning. And that is exactly the point. Because this is how it almost always works. Not with force. Not with fear. But with paperwork. A smile. A receipt you are told you can redeem the moment your contract ends. This is a pattern documented extensively by human rights organizations including Migrante International, which has tracked thousands of cases of Filipino workers in private household employment losing access to their travel documents upon arrival. Cylindra was 33 years old when she accepted the position in Sydney. A registered nurse. Board certified. A decade of clinical work behind her, most of it in palliative care in Batangas City. She knew how to manage a dying patient's pain. She knew how to hold a family together in a room where hope had already left. She was also the primary financial support for her mother, her younger sister Lerma, and her teenage brother Dante, all 3 still in the Philippines, in a house she had been helping keep standing since she was 22. She was not naive. She was not chasing a fantasy of a better life in a fancy house. She was a working professional making a calculated, eyes-open decision to take the highest-paying position available to her, one that would clear her family's debt, fund Dante's university education, and for the first time in her adult life, build something that looked like financial security. The offer came through a licensed overseas placement agency accredited under the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration. The role was straightforward, private palliative nurse to Mrs. Elspeth Alderton, the 72-year-old matriarch of the Alderton family, in the advanced stages of congestive heart failure. Everything on paper was above board. What the paper did not say, what it never says, is that once Cylindra stepped off that plane and handed over her documents, her situation changed entirely. Without a passport, she could not leave. Could not access a bank independently. Could not reach her consulate without permission. She was, in every practical sense, a woman being held in place by the quiet machinery of a system that barely even needed to try. She did not know that yet. She settled in. She was good at her job. She was exceptional, actually. She sent money home every second Friday. She called her mother every Sunday on the monitored staff phone, keeping her voice light, describing the weather, the view of the harbor, the size of the rooms. She was professional. She was focused. She was fine. The man who would change that had not yet walked through the door. Caspian Alderton Wolfe was not what anyone expected. And that, it turns out, was entirely by design. He was 38 years old when Solyndra first encountered him. Eldest son of the Alderton family. Heir to a real estate and resources portfolio worth an estimated $3.8 billion. He had studied law at the University of Melbourne, completed a master's at the London School of Economics, and spent 6 years as a corporate mergers attorney before stepping into the family business. By every measure, he was a man who understood systems. Who understood how power worked. How institutions functioned. And perhaps most importantly, how people moved within them. But inside the estate, he carried none of that weight visibly. He dressed casually. He made his own coffee in the staff kitchen. He addressed household employees by name, not in the performative way of someone who had been coached to seem relatable, but with the specific, unhurried attention of a person who had actually listened when people spoke. The first real conversation he had with Solyndra happened on a Wednesday evening in late January 2021, about 3 weeks after she arrived. He came to check on his mother around 9:30, found Solyndra still at the bedside updating the care chart, and asked what she had changed and why. She told him. Clinically. Precisely. He listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions. Then he told her, simply, that he was glad his mother was in capable hands. He left. She went back to her chart. That was it. But he came back the following evening. And the one after that. Pause here. How long does it take for someone to make you feel truly seen when you are thousands of kilometers from home, your movements are restricted, and your passport is sitting in someone else's safe? It took Caspian Wolfe about 3 months. He remembered that Dante was preparing for his college entrance exams. She had mentioned it once, briefly. Weeks later, he asked how the results had gone. He had filed that detail away and retrieved it at the exact moment it would land with the most weight. He never touched her anywhere staff could observe. He never said anything inappropriate in a room with witnesses. But in the quiet corridors of the medical wing, in the 40-minute stretches after Elspeth fell asleep and before the night guard completed his rounds, the distance between them closed in the way it does when 2 people are tired and isolated and one of them is working very deliberately to make the other feel seen. And Solyndra was isolated. That is not a criticism. It is simply the reality of her circumstances, thousands of miles from home, inside an estate with restricted movement, surrounded by people she managed professionally but could not call friends. When someone offers warmth in that kind of environment, the pull of it is not weakness. It is human. The relationship deepened over 5 months. Slowly. Because Solyndra Fortunato was not a woman who lowered her guard quickly. She had spent a decade watching people at their most physically and emotionally vulnerable, which tends to erode whatever romanticism a person still carries into adulthood. She did not fall. She stepped forward carefully, with her eyes open. Which is precisely what makes what happened next so difficult to sit with. Segment 4, The Betrayal, 10 to 1500 hours. Keyword focus, OFW exploitation billionaire betrayal pregnancy secret Australia. In late July of 2021, 6 months after that first conversation over a medication chart, the engagement was announced publicly. Caspian Alderton Wolfe was to marry Imogen Castleberry Holt, the only daughter of a rival mining dynasty, in a union financial analysts described as one of the most significant private wealth consolidations in Australian history in the past 15 years. The families had reportedly been in formal negotiations for more than a year. Which means those negotiations had been ongoing for the entire duration of what Caspian and Cylindra had quietly built together in those late-night corridors. He did not tell her. He did not come to the medical wing that evening. Or the next. He sent no message. No acknowledgement. No recognition that something between them had existed and was now over. He simply became unavailable. The warmth withdrew overnight. Completely. Cleanly. The coffee stopped. The questions stopped. Dante's name was never mentioned again. Everything stopped. And now, only now, is it worth naming what those 5 months actually were. The specific recall of her brother's name. The deliberate invisibility of his attention in any shared public space. The way he made a confined, restricted existence feel, briefly, like connection. These were not the instincts of a man who had stumbled into something he had not intended. These were the instruments of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, from the very first evening he walked into that medical wing with questions he already knew the answers to. Do you think Cylindra confronted him? Do you think she cried? Tell me in the comments what you think she did next. Because I can almost guarantee you are wrong. It was early August 2021 when Cylindra sat on the edge of a staff bathroom floor and stared at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test she had asked a grocery delivery driver to smuggle in inside a box of medical supplies. She did not cry. She did not panic. She sat there for a long time, very still, in thought. That stillness tells you everything you need to know about who Cylindra Fortunato actually was. She began to assess her situation the way she would assess a critical patient. Identifying the variables. Mapping the risks. Working through every available option in sequence. And one by one, every option closed. Going to a hospital without a passport, without legal documentation, as a migrant worker without independent residency standing was not straightforward. In documented accounts from the Philippine Overseas Labor Office, workers in analogous situations have faced healthcare providers contacting authorities for birth registration determinations, processes that can trigger visa status reviews before any formal protection is in place. Caspian was the second option. She considered it for exactly as long as it took to think it through. Then she set it aside. The man who had ended a 5-month relationship by simply disappearing was not a man who would respond to this news by protecting her. He would respond by containing her. The baby would be, to him, a liability, not a child. One capable of destroying his engagement, fracturing a multi-billion-dollar family alliance, and exposing him to the kind of scandal that does not simply damage a dynasty. It restructures it entirely. Caspian had spent his entire adult life managing risk. Cylindra understood she was now one of those risks. So she did what she had always done. She worked with what she had. And she started building something no one inside that estate was supposed to see. Segment 5, The Plan, 15 to 2200 hours. Keyword focus, Filipina migrant worker self-rescue plan Australia illegal detention. By September 2021, Cylindra Fortunato had accepted one fundamental truth. Nobody was coming to help her. Not because nobody cared. But because nobody knew. And by the time anyone found out through conventional channels, it would likely be too late to matter. So she stopped waiting. And she started building. What followed over the next 3 months was one of the most methodical, quietly disciplined acts of self-preservation I have ever had the privilege of researching. Not because it was dramatic. It was the opposite. Slow. Careful. Invisible work conducted in plain sight by a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing she could do was appear to be doing anything at all. There was a housekeeper in the staff quarters named Tessie Balagtas. 40 years old. Also Filipina. Nearly 4 years inside the Alderton estate. Cylindra had observed her carefully, her schedule, her access routes, her relationship with household management. She had also noticed small discrepancies in the household petty cash logs. The kind of thing a desperate person does quietly over a long time when they have run out of other options. Cylindra sat down across from her one evening in the staff kitchen, waited until they were completely alone, and spoke in a low, even voice. She did not judge Tessie. She did not threaten her. She told her the truth. That she was in trouble. That she needed a partner she could trust. And that what came next, if Tessie was willing, would be better for both of them. Tessie looked at her for a long moment. Then she said yes. Over the following weeks, Tessie's role as a housekeeper gave her access to virtually every corridor, utility room, and service entrance on the property. Access that security staff barely registered because domestic workers moving through a large estate are functionally invisible to people trained to watch for external threats. During her regular cleaning rotations, Tessie mapped the estate's camera positions, guard rotation schedules, and the specific blind spots along the northern perimeter, the side facing a secondary service road rather than the main gate, and reported everything back to Cylindra in fragments during their brief overlapping breaks. Never too much at once. Never anything that would register as a pattern. Then there was the driver. Obafemi Tarrant had worked for the Alderton family for 7 years. Reliable, discreet, and quietly furious after Caspian's head of security had docked 3 weeks of his wages over an alleged vehicle oversight that was never properly investigated. Cylindra observed him for 3 weeks before she approached him. She needed to know whether his resentment made him reckless or careful. It was the latter. She met him in late October during an 11-minute gap in the security rotation. She told him only what he needed to know, that she needed a driver on a specific night to take her to the Philippine Consulate General in Sydney, without notifying management. She would pay him from the cash she had been carefully setting aside for months. He asked her one question. Whether she would be coming back. She told him no. He told her he would be ready. But the centerpiece of everything Cylindra was building was not Tessie's maps or Obafemi's cooperation. It was a letter. Over 2 weeks in November 2021, working in 30-minute increments during the late-night hours, Cylindra composed a detailed, evidenced account addressed to the Philippine Overseas Labor Office, POLO, attached to the Philippine Consulate General in Sydney. A government body established specifically to assist Filipino workers experiencing employment violations or welfare emergencies. The POLO office operates under formal protocols for worker complaints, including cases involving passport confiscation, itself a violation under both Australian law and ILO International Labour Standards. The letter documented everything. The timeline of her employment. The relationship with Caspian, with specific dates. The pregnancy. The passport confiscation upon arrival. The household's refusal to return it on request. Her explicit, clearly stated fear of what would happen to her and the baby once the celebration concluded and she was no longer useful to keep quiet. She included names, dates, and behavioral details specific enough that the account could not be dismissed as the unsubstantiated claim of a distressed employee. It read the way a clinical intake report reads. Measured. Specific. Almost unnervingly calm. She gave both printed copies to Tessie with 2 non-negotiable instructions. If Cylindra went silent for more than 48 hours, send it. If the medical wing fire alarm activated at any point, send it immediately, without waiting. Not to one recipient, to 2 simultaneously, the Polo Labor Welfare Officer, and the Australia correspondent of a Philippines-based labor rights press outlet. And on the last night of November 2021, Cylindra sat alone in the medical wing, long after the household had gone to sleep, and ran through every variable one final time. Tessie. Obafemi. The letter. The cash. The blind spots on the northern perimeter. The combination to the passport safe she had spent 6 weeks learning through patient daily observation of the household manager's morning routine. She was as prepared as circumstances would allow. She knew, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had carried her through everything else, that it might still not be enough. But it was everything she had. And she had built every piece of it herself. In late January 2022, 6 weeks before the engagement celebration, a convoy of 2 black Range Rovers pulled through the Alderton Estate's main gate, and Imogen Castleberry Holt arrived. And everything in that compound quietly shifted. She was 32 years old. The only daughter of Reginald Castleberry Holt, founder of one of Western Australia's largest privately held mining infrastructure companies. Master's degree in finance from Cambridge. She had sat in on her father's board meetings since she was 15. She understood, with the fluency of someone who had grown up inside it, that a marriage between two dynasties of this scale was not a romantic arrangement. It was a corporate merger with a ceremony attached. She had not come to the Alderton estate to prepare for a party. She had come to complete her due diligence. Because here is what Caspian did not know. 6 months earlier, her family's private financial intelligence advisors had flagged 2 outgoing transfers from his personal accounts. The amounts were substantial but not extraordinary for a man of his wealth. What made them notable was the destination, a Cayman Islands holding company with no verifiable business activity and no traceable operational history. 2 transfers. 14 months apart. Totaling just over 4.2 million Australian dollars. Her father's team had been quietly pulling that thread ever since. Imogen arrived with those files already memorized. She was not suspicious in the way that makes a person emotional and reactive. She was suspicious in the way that makes a person methodical and patient. There is a significant difference between those two things. What no one anticipated was how quickly she would notice Cylindra. She noticed the uniform sizing. Cylindra had been requisitioning progressively larger scrub sets since October. The administrative justification was documented and plausible, but the physical reality of the woman wearing them told a slightly different story to anyone paying close attention. She noticed the fatigue. Not the ordinary tiredness of a demanding caregiving role, but the specific, layered exhaustion of a person carrying something beyond their documented workload. And she noticed the hand. Once. Just once. In a corridor outside Elspeth Alderton's room, when Cylindra believed she was alone between tasks. A brief, involuntary gesture, the right hand moving to her lower abdomen, resting there for 2 or 3 seconds before she caught herself and continued walking. Imogen watched it from 12 feet away and said nothing. She did not confront Cylindra. She did not raise it with Caspian. She did not even write it down. It was already filed in the part of her mind she reserved for information that was not yet actionable, but might become so. Within 72 hours, she had instructed her personal security team to install a discreet surveillance feed covering the medical wing corridor and the adjacent supply room. The installation was logged as a routine care monitoring upgrade. It was processed and approved by household administration without a second glance. Caspian was never informed. The offshore transfers. The nurse with changing uniform sizes and tired eyes. The involuntary hand at the abdomen. Individually, each detail could mean nothing. Together, they formed the outline of something she needed to understand completely before she signed her name to anything. And so every night, Imogen sat at her desk with Caspian's financial files spread in front of her, and a surveillance feed open on a secondary screen beside them. She was not afraid of what she might find. She simply needed to know the full extent of it. Before the party. Not after. March 14, 2022. The Alderton estate woke up differently that morning. By 7 a.m., catering teams were moving through service entrances, florists had been working through the night, and a private events company had transformed the main reception hall into something that belonged in an architecture magazine, cascading white florals, imported marble table settings, lighting rigs that had taken 3 days to install. 44 security personnel were deployed across the property. 30 assigned to the reception itself. The remaining 14 at the outer gates and staff entry points. The medical wing had 2 guards. Cylindra noticed that immediately. She had been tracking the security rotation for weeks. A celebration of this scale is not a security event. It is a production. And productions consume resources in one direction, which means they create vacuums in others. This was her window. She had confirmed it with Obafemi 4 days earlier, the date, the time, the vehicle position on the secondary service road, engine off, lights down. He had nodded once and walked away. By 10 p.m., the reception was in full momentum. Music carried through the estate's walls. The sound of several hundred guests filtered through corridors that would ordinarily have been quiet at this hour. Cylindra was 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant. She had spent the preceding months managing that reality with a discipline that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not worked in high-pressure clinical environments. She had the cash envelope. She had memorized Tessie's map. Her hands, as she gathered her small bag, were completely steady. They had always been steady. At 10:55, she moved out of the staff residential wing and into the eastern service corridor toward the northern exit, the gate facing the service road where Obafemi would be waiting. She made it as far as the junction between the service corridor and the maintenance passage. That was where it started. Not dramatically. It began the way it often does, a deep tightening pressure across her lower abdomen that her clinical training identified with cold, immediate certainty for exactly what it was. She stopped walking. Stood in that corridor for approximately 30 seconds, breathing slowly, running a rapid internal assessment. The timing. The intensity. The physical indicators she had been monitoring for weeks. Her body had made a different decision. Obafemi was 200 meters away and unreachable. What was 11 meters behind her was the medical supply room, a windowless, lockable space stocked with everything she knew how to use. She turned around. She moved back down the corridor, pushed through the supply room door, and pulled a heavy equipment shelf across the entrance behind her. The plan she had spent 3 months building was gone. What remained underneath it, the letter with Tessie, the alarm trigger, the preparation she had layered beneath the primary escape route precisely because plans rarely survive contact with the moment they were built for, that was still intact. It was the only thing that mattered now. Somewhere between 11:15 and 11:30 that night, the music from the reception carried faintly through the estate's walls. Distant. Almost surreal. Inside the supply room, Cylindra Fortunato was delivering her son alone. There is no clean or comfortable way to describe what that experience actually involves for someone without pain management, without medical assistance, without another human being in the room. Cylindra knew, professionally and precisely, every stage of what her body was moving through. That clinical knowledge did not make it easier. What it did was give her a framework to hold on to when the pain reached the kind of intensity that strips a person down to something very basic and very animal. She kept moving through it one stage at a time, by narrowing her entire focus to the immediate next thing that needed to be done. She used sterile gloves from the supply shelf. She managed the delivery the way a trained obstetric nurse manages an emergency birth, with the specific, practiced competence of someone who had assisted in enough delivery room crises to understand what the body does and does not need from you in those moments. Her son arrived at 11:41. He was small. Earlier than he should have been. And for a stretch of time Cylindra would later describe as the longest of her life, he did not make a sound. She cleared his airway. She held him. She waited. And then he cried. A thin, reedy, furious sound that bounced off the walls of that supply room and filled every inch of the space. She wrapped him in sterile surgical draping and held him against her chest. Her hands, throughout all of it, had not shaken once. They did not shake now. Segment 8, The Confrontation, 36:00, 43:00. Keyword focus, Billionaire confrontation cover-up newborn baby secret Australia Filipina. What Cylindra did not know, in those first minutes after her son's arrival, was that Imogen's surveillance feed had been active the entire time. The camera installed 6 weeks earlier had flagged the barricaded door at 11:07. The feed had been running on Imogen's secondary monitor while Imogen herself was at the reception. It was that alert that reached the estate's senior security officer first. His name was Darren Keel. 51 years old. He had worked for the Alderton family for 12 years. Longer than most of the household's senior staff. He had a daughter in Canberra. He was, by the assessment of everyone who worked alongside him, a thorough and reliable professional who did not make avoidable mistakes. He reached the supply room at 11:48. he announced himself. Received no response. Used his master access card to disengage the electronic lock. The equipment shelf slowed the door but did not stop a man of his build from pushing through. He stepped into the room. And in the 3 seconds that followed, looking at Cylindra on the floor, at the child in her arms, at a newborn face that bore a resemblance no one in that household could have claimed was coincidental, Darren Keel understood with the full weight of 12 years of institutional loyalty that there was no version of this night where he walked away without consequence attached to his name. He locked the supply room door. He called Caspian off the reception floor. It took 9 minutes for Caspian to arrive. He came in his formal dinner suit, the kind worn to events that get photographed, the kind you can see in the society pages of a lifestyle magazine. He stepped into the room. Looked at Cylindra. Looked at the child. And then did something that, of everything that happened that night, was perhaps the most telling. He crouched down. He spoke quietly, in the same unhurried, measured register she had last heard from him 9 months earlier. He told her he understood how frightening this was. That she had been incredibly strong. That he was going to make sure she was taken care of, financially, permanently. He used the word comfortable. He used the word safe. He told her the child would be given every advantage. He made it sound, for approximately 30 seconds, almost reasonable. Almost kind. Cylindra listened to all of it without expression. And then she asked him one question. Quietly. Without anger. Without tears. Can I take my son home to Manila? The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man deciding there was nothing further worth performing. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Darren Keel and said, simply and without elaboration, to handle it. Make it disappear quietly. No trace. Then he walked back toward the reception. Cylindra waited until his footsteps faded. Then she reached up, took the portable oxygen canister from the lower supply shelf, and swung it directly into the medical wing's wall-mounted fire alarm. The sound that followed was immediate and total. A building-wide alert that flooded every corridor, every stairwell, every space in the Alderton estate simultaneously. Not a sophisticated protocol. A standard building fire alarm available to any person standing within reach of a wall panel at any hour. Tessie heard it. She did not hesitate. She pulled the burner phone from her uniform pocket, opened the 2 drafted messages she had kept ready for weeks, and sent both simultaneously, the first to the polo duty officer at the Philippine Consulate General in Sydney, the second to the Australia correspondent of a Philippines-based labor rights press outlet. The letter was gone. The detonator Cylindra had built by hand over 3 months was live. And 1 floor above, Imogen Castleberry-Holt was watching all of it on a private screen, and she had about 60 seconds to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Do not go anywhere. Imogen had left the reception on the pretense of a private phone call at 11:40, 4 minutes before the fire alarm activated. She had been watching the surveillance feed on her personal tablet from a private anteroom off the main corridor, a space she had identified in her first week at the estate as the one room close enough to the main hall to justify her absence being brief, and far enough from it to allow complete privacy. She had watched all of it. The barricaded door flagged at 11:07. The breach at 11:48. Darren's face in the 3 seconds after he stepped inside and understood what he was looking at. Caspian arriving in his dinner suit, crouching down, performing the same quiet warmth she had watched him deploy in a dozen professional contexts over the preceding months. The carefully modulated voice. The appearance of reasonableness. The architecture of managing a situation rather than feeling it. She had watched Cylindra ask her question. She had watched Caspian stand up, straighten his jacket, and give the order. And she had been completely still through all of it. Not from shock. Not from indecision. But from the specific quality of focus that takes over when a person who has been preparing for a version of a moment finally sees it arrive in its actual form. Because here's what Caspian did not know was happening simultaneously, 3 floors above him. At 11:51, a notification reached Imogen's financial intelligence advisor. The confirmation she had been waiting weeks for had just cleared. One of the 2 flagged transfers from Caspian's accounts, routed through the Cayman Islands structure, had been traced to a legal defense retainer account used to fund representation of a procurement intermediary charged with facilitating the illegal movement of undocumented workers across Australian state lines in 2020. The case had been quietly settled. The charges reduced. The intermediary had walked. Caspian had not been named in the case. He had been, in the language of financial investigators, adjacent to it. Close enough to have funded its resolution. Far enough to have maintained deniability. Careless men do not construct two-layer shell company structures in offshore jurisdictions. This was a pattern belonging to a man who had just ordered the quiet removal of a postpartum woman and her newborn infant on the night of his own engagement celebration. Imogen set the tablet face down on the side table. And then she made 3 decisions in under 60 seconds. The first, her engagement to Caspian would proceed publicly tonight. Canceling the event at this hour would generate a story she could not control. She needed a story she could shape, and that required the night to have already concluded. The second, Solyndra Fortunato and her son would not spend another hour inside that estate under Caspian's authority. The third, how to execute the second without triggering the first. She opened the encrypted channel to her personal security detail, the 4-person team that answered exclusively to her family's payroll, whose salaries, contracts, and ultimate professional loyalty sat entirely within the Castleberry-Holt organizational structure and had never intersected with the Alderton household at any administrative level. She gave them Solyndra's location and 2 instructions. Reach her before Caspian's security team regroups. Bring her to the main corridor. Nothing else. She did not tell them to be discreet about it. That was deliberate. The fire alarm was still running when her team reached the supply room at 11:58, a sustained alert that had by this point pulled guests toward the estate's interior corridors, sent the documentary camera operator into the hallway with her equipment rolling, and prompted 2 prominent business figures to step away from the reception hall with their own security details activated. The estate was full of witnesses. And none of them were there because Imogen had arranged it. They were there because Solyndra had activated an alarm, and building emergency protocols do not pause for engagement parties. Imogen's team communicated through the supply room door. And Solyndra, holding her son in the darkness of that locked room, listening to the alarm and to footsteps she could not yet identify, made the decision to open the barricade. She had no way of knowing whose team was on the other side. But she had built a detonator and she had activated it. Staying inside was the one option that guaranteed nothing good. She moved the shelf. She opened the door. And Imogen's team guided her, quickly, not speaking beyond what was necessary, through the Eastern Service corridor and directly into the main hallway of the Alderton estate, where the lights were full, where the camera was rolling, where 2 prominent guests and a corporate journalist whose press credentials had given him access to the building's interior common areas were standing in the corridor, fully present and impossible to quietly remove. Solyndra Fortunato walked into that hallway at midnight. Still in blood-stained scrubs. Holding her newborn son wrapped in sterile surgical draping. And she did not stop walking. Caspian appeared at the far end of the corridor 40 seconds later. He saw her. He saw the journalist. He saw the camera. He saw the guests whose professional networks were worth more in the long calculus of dynasty maintenance than any internal problem he had been trying to manage in a locked supply room 20 minutes earlier. The mask held, it had to. He had spent his entire adult life understanding that the image is the institution, and the institution must be protected above everything else. But behind it, every structure he had spent the evening trying to preserve had already come apart. He did nothing. There was nothing left to do. The Alderton family's legal team convened at 1:15 in the morning. Documented evidence was already received at the Polo office. The labor press contact had a correspondent making calls before midnight. International witnesses had activated their own channels. A journalist had footage he was under no legal obligation to suppress. Any action taken against Cilindra Fortunato from this point forward did not resolve a scandal. It created one. The legal team's recommendation was unanimous. Stand down entirely. At 4:47 in the morning on March 15, 2022, Cilindra Fortunato and her son were transferred to the formal protection of the Philippine Consulate General in Sydney, escorted by Imogen's personal security team, met at the gate by a duty officer alerted by the Polo Labor Welfare Office 3 hours earlier. She walked through that gate with her son in her arms and her passport, retrieved from the estate's household safe during the chaos of the alarm, in her hand. For the first time in 14 months, she was standing somewhere that Caspian Alderton Wolfe had no legal authority to reach her. On March 16, 2022, 71 hours after walking through those gates, she boarded a Philippine Airlines flight to Manila with her son. He had no name yet. She had decided she would not name him in that city. Some things, she had quietly determined, belong only to home. The Alderton family released a brief public statement describing an unspecified internal matter that had been swiftly and privately resolved. No names. No details. 3 sentences. Absorbed by the news cycle within 48 hours with the efficiency that wealth purchases when the right legal teams are involved. The engagement was formally registered. The photographs showed a composed, elegantly dressed couple. The coverage was favorable. But inside, on the morning of March 15, something was renegotiated permanently and without ceremony. Imogen came to breakfast before Caspian. Her legal team was already seated when he arrived, 3 attorneys from the Castleberry Holt family office who answered to her father and had no professional obligation whatsoever to the man now sitting across the table. She did not greet him with warmth or coldness. Her expression was entirely neutral. The practiced composure of a woman who had learned that the person who maintains stillness in a difficult room almost always controls it. She poured her coffee, set the pot down, and slid a document across the table toward him. A post-engagement financial agreement drafted overnight, precise in its language and unambiguous in its terms. Independent financial authority to Imogen's name. Management rights over a defined portion of the merged family assets, structured in a way that could not be reversed unilaterally. Caspian looked at the document. He looked at her. What passed between them in that silence was not a conversation. It was a reckoning. He picked up the pen. He signed it. Imogen's legal team gathered their documents with the brisk efficiency of people whose morning had gone exactly as planned. Imogen closed the folder. She finished her coffee. Outside the window, the Sydney harbor was perfectly, completely still. 3 months later, Tessie Balagtas landed at Sydney International Airport with her 17-year-old daughter Maribel on a legitimate work visa, properly arranged, documents fully in hand, a position in a family-owned hospitality group that had been quietly facilitated through the same overseas worker community network she had been part of for years. The same network that had helped her identify the labor press contact she had messaged on the night of March 14. She found secure, legal work within a month. Full documentation. A salary that cleared her debts. A passport that stayed in her own possession. In October, she sent Cilindra a photograph from her new kitchen. Maribel beside her. A cup of tea on the table. The warm, bright clarity of a Sydney spring morning through the window. Tessie was looking directly at the camera, and her face had the settled expression of someone who has stopped bracing for the next thing to go wrong. 2 women had entered the Alderton estate as migrant workers under an arrangement designed to keep them invisible and compliant. 2 women had navigated that system, found each other inside it, and made it out the other side. Not because the system had protected them, but because they had protected each other. That is worth sitting with for a moment. In a small apartment in Batangas City, Cilindra Fortunato sat by an open window in the early evening, her son asleep against her shoulder. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted through the curtains in the particular way that makes a familiar place feel, after a long absence, like something closer to a mercy than just a location. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. Tessie's photograph. The tea. The light. Maribel. Cylindra looked at it for a long time. Then she turned the phone face down, held her son a little closer, and did not look over her shoulder. She was done looking back. Cylindra Fortunato never gave an interview. She never sold her story. She went home and she stayed there. The only record of what happened inside that estate is a letter sitting in a filing cabinet at the Philippine Overseas Labor Office in Sydney, signed, dated, and still sealed. Just in case. Now, before you scroll past this, I need you to do something. Think about every woman you know who has ever worked far from home, who has ever handed over her documents and trusted a stranger's word that they would be returned. Think about how many Cylindras are out there right now, building quiet plans inside cages that shine. This story is about a Filipino migrant worker in Australia. But it is also about every person who has ever had their safety depend entirely on their own preparation, because no one else was coming. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If this channel is new to you, subscribe now. Turn on the notification bell. Because we tell the stories that matter, the ones that stay with you long after you close the tab. And if you are watching this, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying right now, may you be protected. May the people who love you find you when you need them most. May every cage you are ever placed in have at least one wall you can reach. And may you always, always know how to find the alarm. God bless you. We will see you in the next one.